My name is Robin, and welcome to English Grammar Now. In this lesson, we're going to be talking all about relative clauses. First of all, let's talk about what a relative clause is. A relative clause is another way of putting two ideas together. It helps us to add information about someone or something in our sentences. It looks like this. If we have two sentences like these, the parents mailed a package to their daughter, and their daughter was living in South Africa. You can see that the repeated thing is their daughter. Well, we can put these two sentences together using a relative clause. It would look like this. The parents mailed a package to their daughter who was living in South Africa. Now we're going to take a look at how to do that. We can use relative clauses to add information to many different parts of a sentence. For example, if we had a sentence like this one, the woman had a small dog with her at the park. We could add information about the woman by saying this. The woman who met me had a small dog with her at the park. We could add information about the dog by saying this. The woman had a small dog who barked angrily with her at the park. Or we could add information about the park by saying this. The woman had a small dog with her at the park where the picnic was. So each of these relative clauses could add information about different parts of the sentence. The word that comes at the beginning of a relative clause is called a relative pronoun. We're going to start by looking at who, that, and which. These are probably the most common relative pronouns. When we use who, we're only really talking about people, but we could be talking about pets. If we use that, we can use it to talk about things or about people. And if you're speaking informally, that is definitely the most common relative pronoun. The last one, which, can be used to talk about a thing or an animal, but we don't use it to talk about people. Here's some basic example sentences. I don't know the man who called last night. We saw the article that you mentioned. She lives in a house which is over 200 years old. So the first one, talking about the man, needs to use who. But if we were talking informally, we could also use that. I don't know the man that called last night. The second one, we saw the article that you mentioned. We could also use which in this case, because which can also talk about things. We would say, we saw the article which you mentioned. Although we can often use which or that in a relative clause, there are a few rules that we need to remember. First of all, if a sentence has a relative clause that is not needed to explain the subject, but is just giving extra information, we call this a non-defining relative clause. You'll notice these because they have commas before and after them. In these kind of clauses, we don't use that. So we could use who or which, depending on if we're talking about a person or a thing. Here's an example. If we use the sentence, Alan, who scored a goal in the last game, was the only player that did an interview on TV. We have the non-defining relative clause, who scored a goal in the last game. And you can see that the commas are before and after it. We can take this clause out of the sentence, and we will have no trouble understanding who the subject is and what it's talking about. This is non-defining because it's not needed to understand the sentence. So in this kind of clause, we wouldn't use that. But take a look at the second example. We have this sentence. The player that scored a goal in the last game did an interview on TV. In this case, there's no commas around the relative clause, and we cannot take it out of the sentence and still understand who they are talking about. Because we use the player instead of Alan, we need the relative clause to explain which player we are talking about. This is called a defining relative clause. In this kind of clause, we can use that. If the sentence has a preposition that is attached to the verb, we can often attach it to the relative pronoun. We do this with the relative pronoun which. Take a look at the example. I've never felt close to the town in which I grew up. Now, the verb here is grew up in. But with the pronoun which, we've moved in to the beginning of the relative clause. Now, we don't have to do this. In informal speech, we're much more likely to say it this way. I've never felt close to the town that I grew up in. That is much more common in informal speech, and moving the preposition with the relative pronoun is a bit formal, but it's something you might see. Also, if the relative pronoun is referring to the whole statement that comes before it, we will use which. Here's an example of that. He said he wasn't interested in science fiction movies, which is what I told her. In this case, the thing that was told to her was he wasn't interested in science fiction movies. The entire phrase. So which is the best choice in this case? Here's your chance to practice. In each of these sentences, there is a missing relative pronoun. So read carefully, remember the rules that we talked about, and see if you can figure out which relative pronoun could go in each sentence. Some of them have more than one option, of course. Here's the answers to those missing words. For number 1, she didn't know the answer, but she tried, which is the important thing. Number 2, could you print off the schedule that you got from school? Or you could say, could you print off the schedule which you got from school? In informal speech, we're much more likely to choose that, but both of these are possible. Number 3, you're the only one who did your homework. Now, who is a pretty likely choice to talk about people, but again, in informal speech, we might choose to say that instead. Number 4, I met one of the new employees who can speak French. We could also say, I met one of the new employees that can speak French. Either of those is possible. And number 5, the books, which were mostly novels, were donated to the school. Here you can see the example of a non-defining relative clause. Which were mostly novels has commas before and after it. So we're using which because we can't use that in this one. Great job! Now, although who, that, and which are the most common, there are some other relative pronouns that we can use. We could use whose to talk about the possession of something. We could use whom to talk about the object of a sentence. Who is for the subject, but whom is used for the object. Where could be used to talk about a location, when to talk about time, and why to talk about a reason. Here's some example sentences for each of these kinds of relative pronouns. The girl whose mother called had been in a fight at school. In this case, the mother belongs to the girl, so we use whose. I sent a letter to the boy whom I'd met on holiday. The boy is the object of the sending of the letter, so it's most proper to use whom. However, in informal speech, whom is not very often used. So even though it's technically incorrect, you'll probably hear people saying who. I know a restaurant where the food is exceptional. Evenings are the time when I relax and read. What is the reason why you couldn't be there? Another thing about informal speech is that sometimes the relative pronoun can be left out of the sentence entirely. It still makes sense, in fact. Take a look at some examples. She's the singer who I heard on the radio. But you might just hear someone say this. She's the singer I heard on the radio. Without who. Because it's obvious what's being talked about, we don't need to have the relative pronoun. The second example. German is a language that I found hard to learn. We could also say, German is a language I've found hard to learn. Here's another way for you to practice. Because relative clauses help us to add information and put it all into one sentence, that's what you get to try. We've got 2 sentences given, and you can put them together in one sentence. Make sure to carefully choose which relative pronoun could be in your sentence. As with before, you have choice in some sentences. Here's what we could write for each of these sentences. For number 1, we have the 2 parts. You gave me the pen, I've lost it. We could put those together by saying, I've lost the pen which you gave me, or I've lost the pen that you gave me. Number 2, Sue is wearing the jacket, and I like it. We could say, I like the jacket which Sue is wearing. Or more informally, I like the jacket that Sue is wearing. Number 3, I gave you the flowers. Where are they? We could put that together in one question to say, where are the flowers which I gave you? Or, where are the flowers that I gave you? And number 4, he told us the story. I didn't believe it. We could put those together to say, I didn't believe the story which he told us. Or, I didn't believe the story that he told us. Just like we've just discussed, we don't have to use a relative pronoun at all. We could say, I've lost the pen you gave me. I like the jacket Sue is wearing. Where are the flowers I gave you? And I didn't believe the story he told us. Those are also perfectly acceptable answers. Great job! Here's a funny conversation to practice relative clauses. See if you can notice where the relative pronouns are being used and what the clause is describing. Have you seen the bag that I brought home from the shop? Do you mean the bag that had ice cream in it? Yes, have you seen that bag? The ice cream is for the boy's birthday I'm in charge of. You left it on the counter when you came in. Where is it now? I didn't know what it was for. Which means what? I ate it. Here you can see the relative clauses highlighted. First of all, we've added some description of the bag. The bag is the one that I brought home from the shop. It's also the bag that had ice cream in it. Then we've described the birthday as the one that I'm in charge of. But you can see there's no relative pronoun. We've just said, birthday, I'm in charge of. Then we have the time described. You left it on the counter when you came in. And we have the description, I didn't know what it was for. Didn't have the purpose of this ice cream. Then we have the short sentence, which means what? In this case, which is asking about the entire phrase that was just said. I didn't know what it was for. What does that mean? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is, I ate it. The ice cream is gone. Thanks for practicing with me using relative clauses to add more information and more description to our sentences. It's been a little bit tricky to practice this grammar sometimes, but I know you'll get it. Thanks for practicing with me, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye!